mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
Roswell, New Mexico, a typical small town on the edge of a western desert. Until July 2nd, 1947. On that night, witnesses claimed to have heard strange sounds and believe there was a flying saucer crash.
And there were 4 beings on the ground.
The military took control of the area, but at a press conference, they insisted it was just a weather balloon. But was the weather balloon story just an attempt to cover up the crash of some kind of unidentified alien craft?
The military definitely was trying to conceal something about the Roswell events, but it had absolutely nothing to do with UFOs, aliens, or anything of the kind.
But some military personnel had different information.
The chest was small, sort of, and the skin looked sort of grayish color. And then the head was large for the proportion of the body. Not real big now, but large. And the eyes were both slanted, sort of.
Was this a victim of the crash at Roswell, or just an elaborate hoax? What really happened at Roswell? We'll try and find out in just a moment. One of the most intriguing and one of the most enduring stories of unexplained encounters is the one universally referred to as the Roswell incident. Did a flying saucer, some kind of unearthly spacecraft, crash near Roswell, New Mexico, early in 1947? For over 50 years, investigators have been unable to even come close to agreement on what really took place there. Has the U.S. government recovered it and kept it hidden all these years? And what of the occupants, if any? What happened to them? Does the American government really know what fell from the sky that night? And if they do, will they admit it? And why, after more than 50 years, do UFO researchers still insist it's crucial that we learn the truth?
Well, Roswell, of course, is the mecca of all ufology. The fact that even many of the serious ufologists tell me they don't believe anything happened at Roswell leads me to think that the evidence is not as good as some of the other believers say it is. What they have here are eyewitness accounts, which are notoriously unreliable, and we can track how they've changed over the decades. And the fact is, Roswell was a non-event until 1974, when Berlitz brought out his book on Roswell, and it became a media event, and there were television shows around it and that sort of thing. That's when it took off. Roswell as a mythic story started in the mid-1970s. It didn't actually happen in the 1940s.
Roswell doesn't fit the standard flying disc reports because there was something on the ground, it had crashed, there was wreckage, and as we found out much later, there were bodies. The advocates and the opponents both have ignored almost all the relevant data which is obtained by talking to the right witnesses, looking up the records in the newspapers, following the story around the country. It was a major event in man's history.
Kevin Randall has devoted years of his life in an attempt to discover the truth and has written several exhaustive studies on the events at Roswell. As an enduring mystery should, it all began on a dark and stormy night in the summer of 1947.
The story that's been told is that Mac Brazel was alone at the ranch in early July 1947 during a thunderstorm. Heard a clap of thunder that sounded much louder, different than normal claps of thunder. Didn't think too much of it that night. The next day he was out on the range looking to see which fields had gotten the rain the night before because he was going to move the livestock, and as he explored the fields he came to an area that was filled with metallic debris.
Captain Randall and many others have said that the pieces of debris that Mac Brazel discovered were like nothing else on Earth. Mac Brazel then decided to bring the matter to the attention of the authorities. So he left the ranch and drove the few miles into the nearest town, Roswell, New Mexico. The sheriff of Roswell at the time was George Wilcox. His granddaughter, Barbara Duggar, recalls the story.
In the 40s, there was a spacecraft, a flying saucer is what Big Mom called it, crashed outside of Roswell. My grandmother stated that my grandfather went out there to the site. And when he got out there, there was a big burned area when they first approached the area. And then they saw debris. He saw debris. I don't know if he was alone. She was not with him. He went by himself. I asked her, I said, you know, out of jokingness, did he see any little space beings? You know? And she said, yes, there was 4 of them.
The sheriff, according to reports, immediately got in touch with the nearby Army Air Base about the field of strange debris. And it was only a short time before officers were on the scene, eager to see what the sheriff was talking about. After all, a field full of debris is one thing, but actual beings from outer space were quite another. What happened next appears to have been either the biggest mistake or the biggest cover-up in the history of the Air Force.
Major Jesse A. Marcel, the air intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, was told by Colonel Blanchard to go out and take a look at the scene himself. Marcel got out there, again, saw an area that he described himself as 3/4 of a mile long, 200 to 300 feet wide, filled with metallic debris. He showed it to Colonel William Blanchard, the commander of the 509th Bomb Group. Blanchard ordered a press release saying that the Army had captured a flying saucer, talked to Lieutenant Walter Hott. Hott issued the press release, wrote the press release, and took it to the various media outlets in Roswell, the 2 radio stations, the 2 newspapers, and from that point it went over the wire.
The release read, in part, the many rumors regarding the flying discs became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers. But there was no mention of the space beings the sheriff told his family he had seen. Was this the beginning of a giant hoax or a giant cover-up? Barbara Duggar's grandmother was still afraid of repercussions 40 years after the event.
She said, the reason that I'm telling you this is because when the incident happened, the military police came to the courthouse, to the jailhouse, and told George and I that if we ever told anything about this incident, talked about it in any way, that not only we would be killed, but the family, that they would get the rest of the family.
But if the Air Force had already admitted publicly that they had in their possession a flying saucer, why threaten a local official and his family if they didn't keep silent?
Having been to 19 archives, I'm not surprised that we haven't found much in the way of file data on Roswell. The government knows how to cover things up. The Eisenhower Library still has 100,000 pages of classified material, all of it older than 1960. You don't get to see top secret code word documents when you go to archives. Very little has been released. If we're lucky, sometime in this century, we'll find out more.
Things soon began to take a different turn. What started out as a simple act of civic responsibility by a local rancher had suddenly become a major military activity. Mac Brazel never said he had seen a downed aircraft. Could it be that the Army discovered something he hadn't seen? And what of witnesses to the whole affair that are still living? What do they have to say today? As headquarters for the 509th Bomber Group, the only bomber group in the world capable of delivering atomic weapons, Roswell, New Mexico citizens were no strangers to terms like secrecy and classified. During the long days of World War II, they had become accustomed to the military's obsession with secrecy, but things were beginning to seem a bit extreme, even to these folks. According to Bill Brazel, Mac's son, his father was also sworn to secrecy. But secrecy about what? Had Mac Brazel found something more than just a field littered with strange debris?
This is basically the point where the Roswell incident becomes a whole series of different mysteries, and they kind of crisscross one another, because if Colonel Blanchard admitted they had a more or less intact flying saucer, then clearly somewhere they had more than just the small bits of metallic debris reported by Mac Brazel.
According to many who were in Roswell at the time, the result of all the activity was a flood of attention focused on this small New Mexico town. But what happened next only added to the confusion.
3 hours later, the official story changes. General Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth, the parent unit to the 509th Bomb Group, now said it was nothing more than a meteorological balloon with a fairly common radar reflector attached to it. According to General Ramey, the balloon had crashed on the ranch. That's what Major Marcel found. He had overreacted, thinking that he had a flying saucer. It was just this weather balloon and the Raywin target reflector.
The U.S. Air Force's explanation is ridiculous when related to the Roswell crash. There were over 3 plane loads of debris that were taken out of the Roswell crash site, and mogul weather balloons take up the space of maybe a 19-inch television set.
Could it be that this photograph was a total fabrication? Here's what the officer on the right, General Thomas DuBose, had to say about the Army Air Force press release claiming the crash was just a weather balloon.
We knew that it was a cover story, and whose idea it was, I haven't the vaguest idea, but we used that in order to assuage the curiosity of the press.
Why would representatives of the U.S. military announce that the debris was from a weather balloon if their senior officers knew otherwise? As it turns out, the officers weren't the only ones to see the debris in General Ramey's office. UFO investigators recently uncovered a civilian photographer who not only saw the debris Major Marcel brought in, he actually photographed it.
On July the 8th, 1947, I was a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I was also a backup photographer there. On that afternoon, my city editor came over and said, go out to General Ramey's office. They're bringing in a flying saucer from Roswell, and we need shots of it, and hurry because we're right on the East Coast deadline. So I hurried out to General Ramey's office, and when I arrived there, the general was not there, but was expected back momentarily. That gave me an opportunity to arrange some of the debris that I saw there on the floor and to try to make the best of a picture. I remember that it was a pretty smelly, burned odor, and it was not very photogenic at all. So in my frustration, I was trying to pose something that would make sense, and about that time the general came back in. He came immediately over and bent over and started to examine the material. And as we look at the photographs now, we see several packages of unopened material, so it had not all been laid out at that time. When the general started to examine it, I asked him, what is this, General? And he shrugged his shoulders and said, damned if I know, and went ahead very intently and looking at the material. While I was taking his picture, he had a piece of paper in his hand that he kept shuffling about, and in the different pictures he was moving this paper around in his hand. And finally, in the last picture, he was actually reading the message that he had in his hand. From that moment, from the time I left, I was the only person there, only civilian there, the only photographer or media person there. And but from that moment on, that material has not been seen by anyone, and it's been locked up somewhere ever since. Why do I think that the scene changed drastically and the attitude changed? I think it was the message that the general was given just as he walked into that room that changed the whole picture at that moment. After 2 years of study, the Roswell Photo Interpretation Team, called RIPIT, has come up with some interesting observations based on the Ramey message. First of all, it mentions victims of the wreck forwarded to Fort Worth. Secondly, it talks about the recovery of the Roswell disk. Third, what is needed at the Roswell site. And then finally, it talks about explaining it as a weather balloon.
Maybe Mac Brazel did find a balloon, But the problem with this is it never explains all the other testimony. It does not explain all the debris.
The Roswell event and everything about it is incredibly complex, and without the kind of detailed and painstaking analysis that I've done over the past 8 years, it's virtually impossible to understand. But after all this research, I am firmly convinced that the Roswell mystery, so-called, has been solved, and it had nothing whatever to do with the crash of an extraterrestrial spacecraft or its recovery by the military.
In July of 1997, people from all over the world beat a path to Roswell, New Mexico. The town's population virtually doubled overnight to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of what many believe to be the Roswell crash. Coincidentally, perhaps, July 1997 was also the time the United States Air Force chose to issue something called the Roswell Report, case closed. The Air Force may consider the case closed, but to many UFO investigators, the report simply added fuel to the controversial fire.
The press was ready when the Roswell story broke. Wow, we have something. Air Force issued instructions to cover it up. General Ramey said it was just a radar reflector from a weather balloon. So in less than a day, the story fizzled entirely until I got involved 30 years later. When finally those stories came out, it was clear that the Air Force explanation did not address bodies, didn't say anything about them. So they came up with crash test dummies, which were indeed dropped in New Mexico. But 6 years later, and all the dummies were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds to simulate pilots. All the alien reports were of beings shorter than 4.5 feet. They must think we're all dummies.
Another book, the day after Roswell, was published in 1997. Its author, Colonel Philip Corso, takes a completely different view. Corso worked in the Pentagon for Army intelligence for a number of years and was National Security Advisor during the Eisenhower administration. He is the most credible witness to come forward.
There's something up there flying around that's beyond our technical capability. We have nothing that can go 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour and break the lock that quick on a radar.
Jesse Marcel Jr., son of the intelligence officer who first examined the debris field, has come forth with an amazing story having to do with that debris that he remembers from his childhood.
Major Marcel brought some of the material home so they could show it to his wife and his son. Then later on he took all of that material back to the Roswell Army Airfield.
He picked it up off the mountainside.
The thing that set this apart from anything that I'd ever seen before or since was the markings on parts of the wreckage. In the I-beam structural members, there was like a writing of sorts. I remember at the time thinking this was like hieroglyphic, but it wasn't really hieroglyphic, but it was more of geometrical forms and symbols.
These markings drew attention of a number of Roswell investigators, and an effort was launched with mixed results. One Native American source translated the glyphs to say, "Female warriors are ready and prepared." Another attempt at translation from a Mediterranean source claimed that the characters were a form of ancient Greek. The English translation, according to this source, was freedom. A word fragment is hardly enough to base any conclusions on, but the questions raised by just the idea that they are words boggles the mind. And why or how would an alien culture use the ancient Greek letters in the construction of their craft? Could this mean that there is literally a universal language?
Roswell was a focal point in man's history because southeastern New Mexico was where we were testing atomic bombs. We tested one here, the first one, where we were firing German V-2 rockets, where we had our best radar. Any visiting alien would recognize that here was the technology that would take Earthlings into outer space. It was certainly worth looking at. They had an accident.
Still, the weather balloon explanation was very nearly the end of what we know today as the Roswell incident, but there were about to be even more startling discoveries. One of the things that keeps the Roswell story alive even today is the story told by this man, Grady Barnett, a civil engineer living in Roswell at the time. Grady Barnett told his friend Vern Maltese what he saw that July afternoon.
Mr. Barnett told me that when he was coming back on one of his field trips, he'd run onto a flying saucer that had burst open, and there were 4 beings on the ground.
4 alien beings beings, as well as an almost intact spacecraft. The number of beings coincides exactly with what Sheriff George Wilcox said he found. Civil engineer Grady Barnett claimed to have seen a crashed flying saucer and the dead occupants of that craft. Could this be the same craft the Army Air Force later claimed to have in its possession? But if Grady Barnett's flying saucer was almost entirely intact, what could account for the massive amount of debris discovered by Mac Brazel? And there was something else. Barnett said all the beings he saw were dead. Sheriff Wilcox told a slightly different story.
And Granddaddy said their heads were large, and the little suit that they had on was just, you couldn't, it was just like silk or something. And I asked her, I said, were the little men alive? Were they dead? And she said, I think one of them was alive.
All we know is that they're not us. And that's a very significant thing. If they didn't originate here, they originated someplace else. And that's something that's very important for us to know, that we're not alone in the neighborhood.
Some theorists have suggested that there were 2 flying saucers rather than just one, each carrying a crew of 4. Some UFO researchers believe that this is the only explanation. By all accounts, the debris was all very small. If these were pieces of a craft of some kind, it must have been totally obliterated.
Based on first-hand accounts of other people who were involved, it's clear that the solution to the mystery was going to be found miles away from the Brazel Ranch, much closer to Roswell. Since the vessel was made of such super strong material, whatever destroyed it must have been a tremendous force.
And what about the material found at the Mac Brazel Ranch? Some who claim to have handled the debris say it was clearly something they had never seen before.
The material discovered at the debris field defied all attempts of the people to explain what it was. The foil could not be cut, the wood-like material couldn't be whittled, it couldn't be burned. So clearly we have material that is not like anything that was available in our society in 1947.
Is it possible that the pieces of debris found on the ranch were really quite natural? For example, could they have come from a meteorite?
Well, a meteor would enter the Earth's atmosphere at, of course, very high speed, and once it meets the resistance of the Earth's atmosphere, it begins to burn up and lose, of course, its size. And what's more, a meteor that landed with an audible impact would have left a gigantic impact crater, such as the one in Arizona.
Whatever struck the ground in New Mexico left no crater. Did create a gouge in the terrain, but that's more suggestive of some kind of a controlled crash than something falling out of the sky.
But something apparently did fall out of the sky that night. A meteor seems an unlikely explanation, and UFO investigators are unwilling to accept the weather balloon scenario.
There are over 400 people who've come forward and made statements about their involvement in the alien crash at Roswell.
We're told that hundreds of people were connected, either eyewitnesses indirectly or directly, to the Roswell event. Doesn't this make it true? No, it doesn't, actually. And first of all, the numbers grow over the decades. More and more people are telling others that they were there when, in fact, if you look into it, they weren't there at all. But the fact is, it doesn't matter how many people say they were there. You have to have more than just eyewitness accounts. You have to have some sort of corroborative evidence, some physical evidence. And until we see that, I'm just going to remain a skeptic.
Are there other possibilities? Has the Air Force offered any other explanations? Something apparently fell out of the sky that night. And in spite of repeated attempts by the government to brush the whole thing aside, UFO investigators are still unwilling to accept the weather balloon scenario. Could it be that all the witnesses are wrong? That the photographs aren't real? That the only one telling the truth in the whole Roswell incident is the government? What do you think?
To the right witnesses, looking up the records in the newspapers, following the story around the country. It was a major event in man's history.
Kevin Randall has devoted years of his life in an attempt to discover the truth and has written several exhaustive studies on the events at Roswell. As an enduring mystery should, it all began on a dark and stormy night in the summer of 1947.
The story that's been told is that Mac Brazel was alone at the ranch in early July 1947 during a thunderstorm. Heard a clap of thunder that sounded much louder, different than the normal claps of thunder. Didn't think too much of it that night. The next day he was out on the range looking to see which fields had gotten the rain the night before because he was going to move the livestock, and as he explored the fields he came to an area that was filled with metallic debris.
Captain Randall and many others will try and find out in just a moment. One of the most intriguing and one of the most enduring stories of unexplained encounters is the one universally referred to as the Roswell incident. Did a flying saucer, some kind of unearthly spacecraft, crash near Roswell, New Mexico, early in 1947? For over 50 years, investigators have been unable to even come close to agreement on what really took place there. Has the U.S. government recovered it and kept it hidden all these years? And what of the occupants, if any? What happened to them? Does the American government really know what fell from the sky that night? And if they do, will they admit it? And why, after more than 50 years, do UFO researchers still insist it's crucial that we learn the truth?
Well, Roswell, of course, is the mecca of all.
A mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
Roswell, New Mexico, a typical small town on the edge of a western desert. Until July 2nd, 1947. On that night, witnesses claimed to have heard strange sounds and believe there was a flying saucer.
All ufology. The fact that even many of the serious ufologists tell me they don't believe anything happened at Roswell leads me to think that the evidence is not as good as some of the other believers say it is. What they have here are eyewitness accounts, which are notoriously unreliable, and we can track how they've changed over the decades. And the fact is, Roswell was a non-event until 1974, when Berlitz brought out his book on Roswell, and it became a media event, and there were television shows around it and that sort of thing. That's when it took off. Roswell, as a mythic story, started in the mid-1970s. It didn't actually happen in the 1940s.
Roswell doesn't fit the standard flying disc reports because there was something on the ground, it had crashed, there was wreckage, and as we found out much later, there were bodies. The advocates and the opponents both have ignored almost all the relevant data which is obtained by talking crash.
And there were 4 beings on the ground.
The military took control of the area, but at a press conference, they insisted it was just a weather balloon. But was the weather balloon story just an attempt to cover up the crash of some kind of unidentified alien craft?
The military definitely was trying to conceal something about the Roswell events, but it had absolutely nothing to do with UFOs, aliens, or anything of the kind.
But some military personnel had different information.
The chest was small, sort of, and the skin looked sort of grayish color. And then the head was large for the proportion of the body. Not real big now, but large. And the eyes were both slanted, sort of.
Was this a victim of the crash at Roswell, or just an elaborate hoax? What really happened at Roswell?